Hello and welcome back to another edition of the Front Page on GNAT TV. My name is Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal, and I'll be your host today. And today it's my pleasure to have with us here at the studios of GNAT Dr. Tom Redden, a professor at Southern Vermont College in Bennington. Tom, welcome to GNAT.
Pleasure. Thank you, Andrew.
Dr. Redden is a professor of history and politics at Southern Vermont College, where he's taught since 1999. He's also a practicing Buddhist and also an ordained Zen Buddhist priest. He's going to be giving a series of talks, and actually has been giving a series of talks at the Unitarian Church in Bennington. We'll also be giving one up here at the Maple Street School in Manchester. So it seemed like the perfect time to have him come up here and talk a little bit about the intersection, I guess, of Buddhism and American politics. Two things one does not normally associate in the same breath, but we'll be here today to unravel that a little bit. But Tom, get us started here. What are some of the basic principles of Buddhism for those who aren't familiar with the faith?
Well, again, Andrew, thank you. It's a privilege for me to be here. And so I grew up a good Irish Roman Catholic. So I was an altar boy. I was in a family where you simply went to church. Mm-hmm. We lived next to the Catholic high school and not far from the elementary school and the Catholic Church itself. So I grew up in a very, very strong Irish Catholic environment. And so religion and spirituality was an important part of my life growing up, and it was something that I embraced. And so I started to study religion in college, and I ended up living in Japan for about a year and a half. And it was there that my interest in Buddhism really blossomed, and I began to go to a well-known Zen temple in Kyoto, Japan, most weekends. And so I became a really practicing meditator at that point, and this goes back to 1978. And so basically since January 1978, after I had been at this monastery for a little bit, the meditation just took a total hold of me. Mm-hmm. And so it was really through the Zen meditation that the religion followed. Okay. And so I lived in Japan and then traveled around the world from there. And so when I came back to the States, I had really transitioned from the Catholic Church, which I didn't reject. It's just that my religious practice came to embrace the meditation. Mm-hmm. And so basically since that time, I've been a practicing Buddhist and was affiliated with Zen Mountain Monastery out in Mount Tremper, New York, as well as the Zen Community of New York, which is now the Zen Peacemaker Order, and that's where I was ordained about 12 years ago. Okay. And so some people would know of Bernie Glassman, who's a well-known Zen master there, and John Dido Laurie's the teacher who's now deceased at Zen Mountain. So these are two very, very prominent Zen masters in the United States. And so I've had the good fortune of being affiliated with their two monasteries or their centers. The exact shape of them have taken different forms. So basically, meditation simply became an integral part of my life, almost 35 years ago at this point. And then slowly but surely, I became more and more involved in these two religious communities, and then the sort of official religious practice came in to view much more. And so one takes the precepts, one becomes sort of an official Buddhist, and then you go to retreats and you do all the studies that's involved in that. So so at this point, it's an integral part of my life, and as a Zen Buddhist priest, I'm able to talk about my own experience as a practitioner. I'm not an official teacher in the lineage sense of Buddhism. But I am a priest, and therefore I can teach meditation. Mm-hmm. I can give talks from my own perspective. And so Buddhism's become an integral part of my life and something I'm very grateful for.
And what are some of the basic precepts of Buddhism? I think most of us probably have heard of meditation and kind of reflective kind of approach, right, but right. I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that.
Well, one of the interesting ideas, the Buddha was this historical figure, just a very smart guy, Siddhartha Gautama. The book Siddhartha is fairly accurate in terms
originating
of the story.
in India, I guess.
It's in what would be now Nepal, but basically in eastern India. And the story goes is that he was born, he was either going to be a worldly prince or a great spiritual leader. And so, make a long story short, he was pampered as a young boy. He went out and he saw, the story goes, a sick man, a dying man, and a corpse, as well as a wandering monk. And as a young man, he was very affected by this, and he decided to strike out on his own, away from his family, like in the tradition of the wandering monk. You can even find them today in India if you go. These are people, they abandon family and society, and they seek the truth or the divine, however they define it.
Okay.
So the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama spent 6 years traveling, studying with different teachers. He came to a place in Bodh Gaya you can go to today, and there's a big tree there. And he sat down, and he felt that he had come to a place, he was about to come to a great understanding. He was on the verge. And so the story goes, and again, this is as much myth as it is, historically we don't really know, but this is the oral tradition that's been passed on and then eventually was written down, is the fact that he sat under this tree and said, I will not get up until I basically have come to understand the meaning of life. Mm-hmm. And so the Buddha, during that nighttime, went to a deep, deep, deep trance and had the great enlightenment experience, so that when he woke up, he was awake, but when he came fully, the story goes as the morning star came up, the Buddha looked up and said, the earth is my witness that I am now the Buddha, which means the awakened one, which is to suggest that, we're asleep to a certain extent and we need to simply wake up. So the idea in Buddhism is that there is no God, that every single one of us is potentially a Buddha. Every single one of us can wake up to being fully enlightened, fully happy, fully alive. And what Buddhism argues is that, number one, you have to live a moral life as a foundation, just like in any other religion. You don't kill people, you don't steal, you don't abuse drugs or alcohol, you don't abuse sex, and you don't lie and you don't steal. So you basically do the 10 Commandments as a moral foundation, and then the idea is that you try to develop your mind. And that's where the meditation comes in, is that we're trying to learn. And much of the argument or Buddha's teaching is the fact that it's because we see ourselves as permanent, that we have our ego. There's Andrew, there's Tom, so here's Tom and I'm Tom, and therefore we see ourselves as very much this permanent entity. And what we do is that we hang on to our opinions, our possessions, and then it's not that we have opinions, it's not that we have the possessions that's the matter, it's the fact that we hang on to them. Okay. And so therefore, if we want to look at the Republicans and the Democrats today, right, if you think about each one of these guys, men and women, they have their own egos, they have their own opinions, that they sort of see themselves as correct. I'm right. I'm right in my position, and therefore I need to hang on to it. So and the problem, I was going to say, is that the problem is not that they have it, it's just that they cling to this in such a way that in fact they get potentially very greedy about it. So instead of being open and kind and generous toward the world, we're basically spend our time protecting our sense of who we are, our identity, our opinions, our money, whatever that may be. So it's not so much the fact that, we have opinions and so forth, it's the fact that we cling to them in a way that's very exclusive. Okay. And therefore that tends to lead to greed and to selfishness and things like that, as opposed to saying, okay, this is my opinion, but I don't really know the answer to this. Right. And therefore, why don't we all have a conversation? Right. Why don't you help me understand? Okay. Well, you sort of anticipated my next question, which is like, what does the whole Buddhist philosophy then have to do, and how does that translate and into modern American politics, which seem about as opposed to what you were describing there in the Buddhist philosophy as anything could possibly be. You're exactly right, because politics is about conflict. Right. It's about battle. Right. One political scientist, very simple definition, politics is about who gets what when. Winners and losers. Exactly. Right. Who gets what when. And if you think about health care, who gets it? We have 50 million people who don't have health insurance. Right. Who gets it, and when do they get it? Number one, do they get it? Among those who get it, what is the quality of care? If you have excellent insurance, you may be able to have every expert in the world. Others may have just emergency care. And does it come immediately? Do you have your private doctor? Do you have to wait at the public hospital? So those are just sort of the political, who gets what, when. And as you're saying, right, it's very much about, it's a win-lose, usually defined in terms of, a win-lose situation. And so, what Buddhism is, it seems to me, and again, one of the things I should clarify is that, 2,500 years ago, the Buddha did not have a political program by any stretch of the imagination.
He didn't anticipate political parties and stuff like that.
Well, not political parties, but again, he lived a time in India, which is very interesting. He was friends with local kings. You know, he was the head of a huge community of thousands and thousands of people. And his people, they moved from one place to the other because he would teach. If you imagine like Jesus traveling through the Holy Land, he would move from town to town.
Right.
And his followers would follow him. The question is, someone needs to feed these people. Anyway, so the Buddha had to develop relationships with the local politicians at the time.
Okay.
Some of the politicians came to him as his students. So anyways, it's not that the Buddha wasn't very political, but in terms of today, we don't want to overstate any sort of lessons that we can get from him. And in Buddhism today, there's what's called the field of engaged Buddhism. And for about the last 40 or 50 years, you have people like Thich Nhat Hanh. He was another Vietnamese monk.
Okay. Right.
He was very active in the Vietnam War. He's Vietnamese. He's a Buddhist monk, great poet. And he was nominated by Martin Luther King, Nobel Peace Prize in 1967, okay? And you're familiar with the Dalai Lama, right? The Dalai Lama, the spiritual and political head of the Tibetan people. Those are two individuals who are practicing Buddhist politics on a day-to-day basis. And those politics would look something like this. Number one is that the individual politician has to appreciate that his or her internal well-being, her internal peace of mind is an integral part of being a good leader. In other words, the ideal king for the Buddha in those days, or a leader today in anyone, is someone who has a very, very serious religious practice, spiritual practice. And, you know, I don't think the Buddhists would care if you're Christian or Muslim. That's not the issue. The question would be, in your spiritual practice, do you embrace the entire world? And as long as you see the oneness of all people, and that you don't see a separation between your religion and others, then from a Buddhist perspective, that's wonderful, okay? So the religious practice is very much focused on trying to get the ego out of the way. I mean, we just think of all the politicians we can imagine, from Hitler to Saddam Hussein to, you know, George W. Bush or Barack Obama. They all have an ego, and we can see that for some of them, their ego really is what ruled their politics. They were so insecure, they needed to control literally the entire world. I mean, if you think about it, you know, what was going on in Hitler's mind? What level of insecurity did he or Saddam Hussein have in their own sort of, you know, characterological makeup that they simply needed to control the world? And George W. Bush had his particular issues. Obama has his particular issues. So it seems to me, from a Buddhist perspective, we're looking at leaders. And again, this is an ideal type, right? This is an ideal type. But that the internal peace of the individual would help lead to world peace. And this is this is a central piece, it seems to me. And when I, you know, have these talks and these sessions, the first thing to do for about 10 minutes is that we all do a meditation. And the idea is that, and what I talk about then is that what we do, and we can just sort of do it a little bit here, is that if we're just going to sit and we'll just breathe, and we'll just breathe for a second together. Okay, so let's just inhale silently, exhale, we count to number 1. We do this silently, but I'll do it out loud for demonstration purposes. 2, 3, we go to 10, back to 1. So we can very quietly. And the idea is in the process of developing the mind, and this is what the Buddha is teaching. The fact is that we can all become Buddha-like by teaching ourselves, by disciplining the mind, to learn to be present, literally in this moment. So here we are, we're following our breath. So, you know, our breath is our lifeline to this life itself. So we follow our breath. And the idea is that as we slow down, our body is still. You know, I'm sitting on a pillow in a very single position. And so we follow our breaths very, very slowly. And what happens is that obviously our body slows down. Our mind is slowing down, and then it seems to me that our heart, our emotions begin to slow down as well. And when our emotions slow down, it's less about Tom. It's less about Andrew. It's simply about sort of we're both here, right? We're both here. We can appreciate that opportunity. And therefore, when we talk about other people, the separation between ourselves and others tends to disappear. So as we quiet down, we quiet the heart, it means that literally the walls between us and other people, they literally begin to melt away. And so if one wants to meditate for 10 minutes or 10 days nonstop, the point is, little by little, the walls that separate us, they tend to simply dissipate. And at that point, we're living wide open to the world, right? Not only the pain of the world, but also the joys of the world, okay? And so it seems to me one of the things why I think Buddhism can be so helpful is that there's a lot of yelling and screaming in our politics today. Mm-hmm. You know, if we look at the news and we look at everything from Rush Limbaugh to who are some of the other major people? You know, Bill O'Reilly. I mean, Bill O'Reilly's a sort of classic. Or John McLaughlin, you remember John McLaughlin?
Sure.
He had to yell.
Jon Stewart.
Right. And Jon Stewart to a certain extent, exactly. And so the volume goes up, and therefore we move into the whole emotional realm. And so the idea is that to sort of tone that back down, mm-hmm. and let's actually talk about the real world, okay? And so again, to stay with the precepts piece, everyone can be a Buddha. The idea is that you live mm-hmm. a moral life, and then ideally one begins to meditate, and mm-hmm. one can do yoga or walking, whatever it may be, but we do a discipline that helps our mind learn to be present. And when we're able to be present, we sort of are less egotistical, we're a little more open to the world, and therefore we're more generous and in fact loving in the world.
I was just going to ask, I mean, do you see any evidence at all, anywhere, that any of these values are being, seeping into the mainstream of U.S. politics, or how that might even happen in the first place? Because basically, listening to what you were just saying there, I think, well, that sounds about 180 degrees apart from what I'm used to watching on the TV in terms of political combat.
Exactly. And part of the way I framed this whole series was the idea of envisioning a politics of compassion.
Right.
And I think the first thing we need to do is to remind ourselves that, in fact, we have choices here in terms of the kind of politics that we're living. And so to put out a different model like this, mm-hmm. it seems to me, is a way for hopefully to shift the conversation away from yelling and screaming and all about me mm-hmm. to about how about all of us. Mm-hmm. You know, and I'll just take a perfect example is that for folks who haven't had the chance to live outside the United States, it's hard for, and most Americans haven't traveled that much, it's hard for Americans to recognize that there are other ways to do things, right?
Okay.
Healthcare is just one example of that. And I've had a chance to live in Asia, Latin America, Europe, most of these places, everybody, it was just universal, it was a given. What do you mean you don't have health insurance? But you're the United States, you're a rich country. Everyone doesn't have health insurance? That doesn't make sense to people in Japan or Europe or someplace like that, much of Europe. And so the notion that we have 50 million Americans without health insurance, 50 million. Mm-hmm. When George W. came to office, it was 40 million. When he left office, it was 45 million. When Obama came in, it was 45. And with this recession that we're in, we were going from 45 to 50.
Right.
And that's 1 out of 6 people. And for the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and the only industrialized country without universal health care, to me, that's both as political scientist, as a Buddhist, as a human being, that's appalling to me. Mm-hmm. And so it seems to me that, you know, one of the things that Buddhism is really focused on, and the Buddha, you know, Jesus was asked the question, you know, Master, give us a simple commandment, because there are a bunch of them. He says, you know, love your neighbor as yourself for the love of God. Do that, right? And if we were to take that simple principle of loving your neighbor as yourself for the love of God, we could put that side by side, that nice Christian message, besides the Buddha. And the Buddha had 2 things to say. He says, number one, I teach one thing. I teach suffering, what he called dukkha. I teach suffering and the elimination of suffering. And so the elimination of suffering is this idea we live a moral life, and we learn how to meditate, and we're able to sort of let go of stuff. We let go of our clinging, right? And so the other thing, so he says, number one is that I teach suffering and the elimination of suffering. He says the other thing is that, he says that hate never conquers hate. Only love conquers hate. I'll say it again. Hate never conquers hate. Only love conquers hate. And it seems to me that both the Buddha and Jesus are saying the exact same thing. Number one, we have to love each other. Very, very simple. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at the healthcare debate that's going on right now and whether or not this individual mandate is going to be the legal mechanism by which it's tossed out.
Right.
The amazing thing is that our entire political debate was around individual mandate. The government's going to force people this, the government's going to do this. Well, what gets lost is the fact that, number one, there are 50 million people without health insurance. And if, you know, I have 2 daughters, I'm happily married, have 2 beautiful daughters, and my kids need an enormous amount of health care. And if our children did not have health insurance, I'm not sure my wife would ever sleep at night, literally.
Sure. Yeah.
Because the fact is that we know that our kids need this, and we don't have that kind of money. We simply don't. And therefore, if we don't have health insurance, man, we're out. And when it comes to your children, you know, everything becomes secondary at that point.
Yeah.
So the fact that we have 50 million people, you know, I don't know exactly, it's got to be what, 15 million kids anyways, and their parents, you know, most of these people are families, right? This is not single young men. That's not who these folks are. I mean, there are those. But anyways, but the point is that we have 50 million people who are really suffering at whatever level, emotionally or physically. You know, Harvard did a study that stated that about 4 or 5 years ago, that stated that 45,000 Americans die every year prematurely or just die flat out because they have no health insurance. 45,000 Americans. Now that makes sense. You got 50 million without health insurance, 45,000 would die prematurely. And the question I have is, why isn't that number, we're talking about you know, the individual mandate for 6%. You know, the individual 94% of people are not affected by the individual mandate. Their insurance will not be affected by Obamacare.
Right.
They won't be affected. So 94%, their situation remains the same. This whole debate about individual mandate, we're talking 6% of the American population. You know, when we get the sense, it's like most of them, right? But we're only talking about 6%. And the thing is that we're not talking about the 45,000 Americans who have died this past year because they have no health insurance. We're not talking about the fact that Obama's program is going to insure 32 million Americans. 32 million Americans. And so I asked the question, all right, here we are in this debate. It's a huge debate. We've got 50 million people without health insurance. Why are we only talking about 6% and the individual mandate when there is this huge reality out there, which is that a big chunk of our population is suffering because they don't have access to health insurance? So it seems to me that one of the things that Buddhism can do, might be able to do, is help us move beyond this notion of, well, this is what the Republicans say, or the conservatives, this is what the liberals say. And let's look very squarely let's look at who in our society is suffering. We've got 35 million Americans who are poor. So, Republican candidate, what are you going to do about 35 million Americans who are living in poverty today? Do you have a program to eliminate that poverty? And I ask the same thing of Obama. You know, this is the thing, is that there are 2 pieces, Andrew, is that there's the Democrat and Republicans, you know, and what strikes me today, neither of them are talking about the fact that, you know, we have 15% poverty in the United States, and, you know, it's all about the middle class. But we've basically abandoned poor people. If we go back to the 1960s, LBJ says we have 2 things, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to eliminate poverty in the United States of America, we're going to eliminate racism in the United States of America. That was 1965. Here we are in 2012. Nobody dares talks about that because the fact is we don't talk about poor people. And so part of what I'm hoping will happen is that by trying to sort of refashion the conversation a bit, number one is that we can think about what is it that we're asking our politicians? Is it really about them and their ego and their scenario, that they are the only ones who are right? And one of the things I want to push here is this notion of politics as being a win-win. is that why can't the Republican leadership and the Democratic leadership say, we have a problem, here's 50 million Americans without health insurance, we've got to deal with it. We have 35 million people who are living in poverty. You know, we got 1 out of 3 African American men between 18 and 25 who are in prison or have been in prison. These are the people who are suffering most acutely in our society. What can we do about this together? Let's have a liberal conservative solution, but let's deal with it. And the problem is that today the Republicans, and they're very, very good at this, they are willing, they're not, you know, what was Mitch McConnell, the senator, said, you know, very early on, right after Obama was elected, our number one objective is to make sure he doesn't get reelected.
One-term president, right.
In the meantime, we have all these people who are suffering. And so it seems to me what we need to do, any sort of moral politics or a politics of compassion, let's look at the people who are struggling and let's settle this stuff. That's the issue.
Well, it sounds like there are those who are trying to do that, or at least trying to find the middle ground, although certainly, I mean, one of the popular interpretations of American politics for the last 20 or so years, we have become a more polarized kind of...
No question about it.
Whereas there used to be a sort of a moderate grouping in the middle that would... Solutions like that could be funneled through.
Exactly.
That seems to have eroded somewhat in the last 15 or 20
or
so
years.
years.
I think personally the Republicans and the conservatives have to take responsibility for this. You know, if we look at the 20th century, it seems that, you know, from the 30s to the late 70s, it was a liberal democratic vision. The New Deal, the Great Society, government programs, helping poor folks, helping with education. Since that time, the Reagan Revolution has really changed the conversation. And it's very much about privatization, and you know, and the other piece is the fact that the Republicans know how to win elections. These guys are very, very good, and it seems to me this is part of the problem. Is that what they do? They take those Lee Atwater and Karl Rove and these folks. They take the so-called wedge issues. This isn't about whether or not children have you know, food at night. Gays, guns, and God. Right, the 3 Gs, and it's a staple, and therefore you divide the country. Do you support gay rights, yes or no? Abortion, yes, no. Guns, yes or no? You divide the country, and you polarize the country, and you mobilize your base, which is what the Republicans have done very effectively. And now the Tea Party, we're really at the extreme end of the Republican Party. The Tea Party, they're unwilling to even talk about taxes. I mean, this is one of the great problems, it seems to me, is that ideologically we are in this giant ego container in which the conservatives argue that it's no taxes, not today, not ever. And the funny thing is, of course, is that Ronald Reagan is their icon. And yet Ronald Reagan, as governor of California, as well as president, had significant tax increases because he understood that deficits were a problem. So this is one of the dilemmas, is that the Tea Party, you know, they say that we're going to be Ronald Reagan-esque, but therefore we're not going to compromise. But the fact is that Ronald Reagan compromised not only on taxes but also with the Soviet Union. You know.
Well, Tom, I guess we're going to have to leave it at that point. It sounds like a very interesting series of talks you've given down to Bennington and are in the process of giving, and also the one that's coming up at Maple Street School on April 27th. Now, I guess folks, if they want to find out about the time and place, they can contact Maple Street School, I guess, for that? Or
Right, it will begin, it's this Friday the 27th. I guess, anyways, it's Friday the 27th from 7 to 8:30.
Okay,
and then there's the 2 more in Bennington, May 1st and May 15th, so 2 Tuesdays. So.
Well, there you have it. Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure, Andrew.
Real pleasure having you on.
Great. Pleasure's been mine.
And thank all of you for watching today. This has been The Front Page on GNAT TV. My name is Andrew McKeever from the Manchester Journal. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you the next time. Have a great day.